Well, hi everyone. We're going to do a little time travel today here in the museum. We're in the section of the museum that's all about home life and school life, and today we're going to focus on what was it like at the homes back in the day when Tustin was still growing. We're actually going to go back 100 years. So I want you to think about it. Now is 2020, and we subtract 100 years. That means we're talking about the year 1920. Now, the population of Tustin 100 years ago was less than 900 people. Do you know that today, after the census is taken, we're probably going to be 80,000 people plus? So think of that in 100 years, how much Tustin has grown. Back 100 years ago, Tustin High had not even been built. The first class began in 1921. World War I had just ended 2 years previously. So 100 years ago, life was quite different in Tustin. That's what we're going to take a look at today. Back 100 years ago, there were no TVs. There were no cell phones back then. There were no microwaves, electric refrigerators, or even automatic dishwashers back then. Homes did not have air conditioning, and most of the modern conveniences that we know did not exist back then. Children didn't have organized sports teams. There were no video games. There were certainly no electronic devices like computers or iPads. It was a much simpler life, very unlike today. So what was it like? What would you have to do 100 years ago in your home? Well, first of all, most moms worked inside the home rather than having a separate job outside of the home. And if the family owned ranch land or farms, both the moms and the dads worked extremely hard to keep it running smoothly. Of course, when children were old enough, they would have to pitch in and help around the ranch or farm. Children would often help feed or give water to the chickens. They would gather the fresh eggs that the hens had laid that morning. Older children might even get up and help to milk the cows before school started. Family vegetable gardens always needed to be watered, weeds pulled, crops picked, and brought into the house. There was always something to do and some way that children could help on the family farm. Now, I talked to you a little bit about how there weren't too many modern conveniences. There was not a modern electric refrigerator or freezers like we have today. They used what were called ice boxes 100 years ago. A large block of ice was placed inside of a large ice box, kind of like a big wooden box. And it had a door to keep the food inside with the ice to keep it from spoiling. Families would have a block of ice delivered weekly to keep their perishable food cold. In this part of the museum, what you see is a pie safe. Now, most of you are probably wondering, why do we need to keep the pie safe? Well, it simply was a little box with shelves and a screen. And a pie or baked goods or maybe even family fruit, we even have some farm fresh eggs down here, they would be kept inside of a pie safe to keep pests like flies and other bugs out. And they would usually last throughout the week. Now, another device, if we walk over here, here we have a Maytag washing machine with a wringer. Well, let me talk to you about how clothes were washed back then. Before we had devices like this Maytag, this was the family washing machine right here, okay? This washboard would be placed inside of a bucket. You'd put your clothes inside the bucket, get them soapy and wet, and you would scrub and get all of the dirt out of the clothes. Then you'd have to get fresh water, rinse them, wring them, put them on a clothesline. Now, around 1920, things got a little bit easier. Here we have a Maytag washing machine, and it has a large washing area inside, like a big bucket. And you would have to bring in water in the form of buckets, pour it in, put your clothes in, put your soap in, and then close it, and the clothes would be washed. At that point, you'd have to drain the water, get in fresh water, rinse the clothes, make sure all that soap was gone, close it, let it run, and now the clothes were rinsed. But wait, there's more. Because then the next thing is you would have to take your clothes and you'd have to get all the water squeezed out. This device right here is called a wringer. And that's because instead of wringing the clothes with your hands, you would turn this handle, it would turn on these electric rollers, you would put the clothes through the roller, pull them through, being extremely careful not to get your fingers in the wringer, ouch. And as the clothes came through, you'd put them into a basket. From there, you'd carry the wrung clothes outside to a clothesline, use clothespins, and let the sun and the air dry your clothes. Washing clothes for a woman 100 years ago, or for anyone who was doing the clothes, would take almost the better part of a day. It was quite an ordeal. You would have one day of the week devoted as wash day. But then you weren't done, because back then clothes were primarily made of cotton. And that meant that there was no permanent press where you could just wash clothes, take them out of a dryer, and hang them up. Once the clothes were dried outside on the clothesline, you would bring them in, and this was a device called an iron. Now, many of you may or may not know what an iron and an ironing board is, but 100 years ago, there were no electric irons. This device here would have to be heated on the family stove. So this is a cast iron stove, and inside this door, they would put hot coals or maybe wood. Once it got hot, they would place this iron, made of iron, right there, and they would have to wait until it got heated. When it got hot enough, they would have an ironing board with their clothes. They would take it, rub it over the clothes in order to get the wrinkles out. And they had to do that for each piece of clothing. And you can imagine how long this probably took, because this iron didn't stay hot, but maybe for a few minutes. So when it cooled, it no longer got the wrinkles out. They would have to put it back on the stove, and they'd have to let it heat again. And the process would go on and continue and so forth. That was quite a big ordeal. So you might have one day for washing and another day for ironing. Now, before electric or gas stoves became common, I told you this was the family stove. It's a cast iron stove, which means that it contains the heat. And not only could maybe something be placed here or close to the family wood or coals, but they would maybe put, this has room for, it looks like 2 pots. And of course, this is a handle for a pan that they might put on there. And they would lift it up, or maybe even lift this up, to let some of the heat out. They could put a pot right in place of this circle, and it would cook the family food. No electricity back in those days. It was all heat brought in from wood or coal. Now, you may be wondering why I'm holding up this rug. Well, while Mom was busy cooking dinner, children might have finished their homework, and there were chores to do. Everybody pitched in around the house. So they might be sweeping the floor, setting the table for dinner, and maybe taking out all the rugs in the house, putting it up on the clothesline, and then they would use this lovely device called a rug beater, and they would have to sit outside and do this until all the dirt came out of the rugs, and then place them back in the house where they belonged. But there were other things that children could do to help out. So now we're going to come over to another device that was used inside the home and was part of work for maybe moms, grandmas, or even older children as they learned to use this sewing machine. This is a Singer sewing machine. It is not electric. The way it is powered is by this foot pedal down below. And so you would have to pump the foot pedal, which would spin this wheel, which would then connect to the thread and the needle, and it would move the needle up and down. You would take your hands, and as the machine was working and you're pumping with one foot, you would place the cloth under the needle and you would sew. And this was how rips in clothing were patched, or maybe your clothes needed some mending. And so the family would use this sewing machine to help fix your clothes. But it was also a good way that you got new clothes. family couldn't maybe afford to get new clothes at a store in Santa Ana, then mom and grandma might actually make your clothes with this machine. And they would order material, have a pattern, cut it, put it together, and sew it. And you would be so proud when you got new clothing, perhaps on a birthday or a special holiday. Many girls learned how to sew when they got older, and it was very common back then to have your clothes made with a sewing machine by your family members. Well, we spent a little bit of time last time talking about what the work might have been in home life. Now we're going to talk about what did they do for entertainment and fun when all the work was done. Weekends might have a neighborhood baseball game. Kids might put on their metal skates, tighten them with a key, and go roller skating. They might even plan to go fishing in a local fishing hole, or maybe playing a little game of stickball in the neighborhood. There were no organized sports teams back then, so kids made their own teams and made their own fun. Now, little girls were often known to play with paper dolls. Paper dolls would maybe come in a little book or maybe in a very popular magazine. And girls would spend the day cutting out the paper dolls, and then they would have other pages that would have different outfits. And with little tabs, they would fold the clothes over their paper dolls. Again, these were in days before we had the Barbie doll. So again, girls had their own dolls, but sometimes made out of paper, and they were called paper dolls. Children would enjoy a lot of other indoor games, like maybe playing with marbles and jacks, and that is actually in the Tustin trunk. If you get that to come to your classroom, maybe you can actually learn how to play a game of marbles and jacks. It was played with several children. You would draw a circle or make a circle out of string, and you would have different marbles that you would maybe try to shoot out of the circle, or sometimes you would bounce a ball and try to pick up jacks. There were lots of different games that could be played. And even there were times when kids would just go outside and jump rope. I bet some of you know how to play jump rope games even today. Sometimes they would maybe even have a large oak tree in their yard. Dad would hang a large thick rope that had knots in the bottom, and children could ride on that rope like a little family swing. It was lots of fun. What would families do as a whole group? Well, a family might even go out and have a picnic. There was a place not far from Tustin that was called Orange County Park. Now that was the old name. Today it's known as Irvine Park. I bet you've heard of that. Sunday mornings usually involved attendance at a church or maybe even a temple. And following that service, Sunday afternoon was a time when the family would maybe go somewhere in the family car. And they would all pile in together, and there would be some special destination. Maybe they would be going to their aunt and uncle's house or grandma and grandpa's house if they lived nearby. Maybe they'd even drive out to that lovely beach out in Newport, or maybe some other new destination they had never explored. Sometimes they even drove through some beautiful orchards just because it was beautiful to see and the smell of the orange blossoms was so enticing. They even had special autumn events back then. Sometimes if they lived on a ranch or a farm, someone would have a large wagon, put in bales of hay. The kids would climb in on the hay. The person who drove the tractor would pull that wagon, and they'd have a hay ride. It was always a lot of fun. And a lot of times they just had harvest celebrations when the crops were picked. Now, there were some little things that they might have had inside the home that gave some entertainment. The first one I'm going to talk to you about is actually in the Tustin area trunk. This is called a stereoscope. And it's called stereo because there's room for both of your eyes, stereo meaning two. So you would put this up. It had a little stand. And you'd put it up to your eyes. There would be a variety of different picture cards. Now, right now, there are two pictures, right? Well, as you put this on the stereoscope, and as you brought it into focus, you would bring it up to your eyes, and the two pictures would magically turn into one picture. Now, many of you may have heard of a similar device that we've had later in history. It was called a Viewmaster, and it was very much the same thing, where you would put this device up to your eyes and see some fun pictures or maybe even a story being told. And that's what this early stereoscope was a version of. Now, many of you may be wondering, what is this large box? It's called a Victrola. Have you ever heard of something that's called a record player? Well, this is the very first version of a way that music could be heard. Today, we might have had iPods, maybe you even stream music on an Alexa or an Echo. But back 100 years ago, this was how you listened to music. There's this little device on a turntable, it's called a record. It was placed on the turntable. Then there was a little hand crank on the side, and you would just crank it a couple of times. You'd turn the switch on, you would take this needle and very carefully, you'd place it on the record. And there is the music. If you wanted it louder, you'd open the doors and the sound would come out. When you wanted to stop it, you'd carefully lift the needle, put it back, turn the switch off, and that's how you heard music. This is called a Victrola. Now, there was another way that you might hear music if you didn't have a Victrola and records. I'm going to walk over here to this other very large box. I can remember my grandparents having a large box like this, and this is what was called a radio box. And you would have this as a beautiful piece of furniture, maybe in your family room. You'd all gather around. The kids might be sitting here on the rug, mom and dad might be in their favorite chair. You would turn it on, you would have different buttons set for your favorite stations, and this dial would turn to a radio station number. Here are the speakers down below. Everybody would sit around and wait to hear what their latest show would be, who the next star was going to be to sing. Or maybe sometimes they just told stories. Where we see episodes on TV, they had episodes on radio, and they would wait from week to week to hear what had happened to their favorite characters and how the story would progress. Now, this, of course, the Victrola and the radio all happened before TVs were invented. We have a sample of an early TV. We're going to take a look at that next. All right, this is the last item we're going to be talking about here in the museum. This is an old-fashioned original TV, probably from the 1950s. In fact, this one said it was actually made in 1946. But most families could not afford to have a TV in their home until probably the 1950s. So that would have been 30 years after 1920. Well, here is the TV screen. It was in the form of a circle. Here are the knobs for turning it on, and right over here would be the knob for changing the channel. You see, boys and girls, back then there was no remote control. You had to get up out of your chair and go turn the channel. And you might only have 5 or 6 channels if you were lucky. And of course, it would always come around, not in color, but in black and white. Color TVs didn't come into the home until probably the 1960s. But again, the family would gather around and see those early TV shows just like they used to listen to the radio. Well, everyone, as you can see, home life had a lot of hard work during the week. But after the work was done, there was always time for family fun. I hope you enjoyed our tour of home life in early Tustin.
Today we're going to talk about early transportation in Tustin. Today we have many ways that we get from one place to another. We can take a car, or a school bus, or a city bus. We could take an airplane to go a far distance away, or a train. And we can even, of course, walk or jog. Some people even have a hoverboard today, which is quite progressive and modern. However, the early pioneers who came to Tustin probably came across the prairie to California in a covered wagon. That's exactly how Columbus Tustin and his family came down from Northern California in a covered wagon, and even Charles Utt was only 8 years old when he arrived in a wagon with his family. Then in 1862, President Lincoln established a national railroad system. The Union Pacific Railroad laid tracks from the Missouri River going west, and the Central Pacific Railroad laid tracks from starting in Sacramento, California, going east. The goal was for the two railroads to meet in the middle and create one national railroad called the Transcontinental Railroad. On May 10, 1869, the project was completed at Promontory Point, Utah. During a special ceremony, a golden spike donated by future Tustin resident and early pioneer David Hughes was used to connect the two railroads. Because it was made of gold, they didn't leave it there, of course, but it is in a museum today in the San Francisco area. We're lucky to have a model of the golden spike here at the museum for you to see when you visit. This new national railroad line, the Transcontinental, now made it much easier for people to travel across the United States and move west, even to Tustin. Now, a local state railroad line, the Southern Pacific Railroad, came to Tustin in 1888. It connected Los Angeles to Anaheim to Tustin and back again. It ran 2 times a day. It left Tustin at 8 a.m. in the morning and arrived in Los Angeles around noon. And then it left Los Angeles around 1 p.m. and arrived back in Tustin before it got dark. The engine then spent the night in the railroad yard where it was polished and turned around so it was ready to go the next morning. The train station was located on Newport Avenue, just about where Wahoo's Fish Taco Restaurant is today. The train company wanted to extend their line to San Diego, but the Irvine Ranch stopped them from going through their land, so they couldn't do it. Finally, the Santa Fe Railroad, another local line, finally completed that route going from Santa Ana to San Diego, but it only made a quick stop in South Tustin. In 1886, the Santa Ana, Orange, and Tustin Street Railway was created just to carry people from nearby town to nearby town. The rail or track system was actually laid on the dirt roads and consisted of an open-air horse-drawn trolley, fondly called the Orange Dummy. Because the trolley was permanently on a track, it couldn't physically be turned around. So instead, the horse was just unhitched from the front and hitched back up to the other end. The seats were then flipped so they faced the opposite direction. Now they were good to go again. The horses were finally replaced by the steam engine in 1896. The early pioneers in Tustin used their horse and wagon or carriage for both everyday life and for their business. Wagons and carts were used to make all kinds of deliveries. In this first picture, we have a wagon that is delivering oranges from the groves to the packing house. The next picture is of Lou, one of our local Chinese residents, delivering their fresh vegetables. The Na Murray wholesale grocers delivered their groceries in a cart or wagon and later became what we know today as Smart and Final. And this last picture is Frank Jones delivering his milk in 1918. Of course, the family horse, when he wasn't pulling the family wagon, was always a popular mode of transportation. But you had to be sure your horse always had plenty of water when you took him to town. So Columbus Tustin even provided a watering trough so that your horse could be drinking water while you're inside his store shopping. A stagecoach occasionally stopped at Fuller's Drugstore in downtown Tustin, which also housed the Western Union Telegraph Office and the Wells Fargo Express office. The very first bicycles that were invented were made with a giant front wheel and a small back wheel. They were so hard to balance and ride. However, in the 1880s, bicycles became very popular because a safety bike was built with two wheels the same exact size, hand brakes to help them stop, and other necessary safety features. Men, women, and children began riding their bicycles as both a way to travel around the community and for entertainment. Even bicycle races became popular. You can see from this photo how popular bicycles were, even to ride to work. Can you imagine no traffic jams and no freeways around Tustin? By 1890, there were only 3 automobiles in all of Orange County. However, in the early 1900s, automobiles began to be mass-produced in factories, and so the prices dropped. That made them much more affordable for the average person, and they started appearing around Orange County. But still, we only had dirt roads, of course. The first automobile, which was affordable, was the Ford Model T. This is a similar car, and it looked very much like that model. The Model T was created in 1809, but it didn't arrive in Tustin until several years later. Of course, the roads and streets were still just dirt, so they were always dusty and got really muddy on rainy days. There were also very few gas stations at that time, so it really wasn't very convenient to rely on your car. As automobiles became more popular, people needed better roads to travel. The first paved road in Tustin was part of the new State Highway 101. It was a road that was built from San Francisco all the way down to San Diego. And it went right through downtown Tustin on D Street, or what we call today El Camino Real. This road was paved in 1914, but most of the other roads in Tustin remained dirt until well into the 1920s. One of the favorite pastimes for children of Tustin was to hang out downtown and watch the travelers passing through Tustin on their way to Los Angeles or to San Diego, depending on which way they were going, of course. One of the gas stations situated on the old highway was the Tustin Garage. This same old building is where the Black Marlin restaurant is located today. It was pretty exciting in those days to watch the travelers just get gas or fix a flat tire. Of course, transportation in Tustin today looks very different, doesn't it? No covered wagons or horse-drawn carriages, but we still do walk and use our bicycles. No more dirt roads. In fact, all the roads in Tustin are now paved, some with even 6 lanes of traffic going down them. No longer does it take a half a day to get to drive or get to Los Angeles or San Diego due to much improved roads and freeways. We even have major freeways intersecting in the middle of Tustin. Automobiles have improved through the years also. We can now travel probably at least 3 times faster than those old cars, and some cars today can even drive themselves. We can only imagine what transportation is going to look like in the future. When Columbus Tustin first started his city of Tustin, he knew that in order to get people to move to his little community, they needed certain services. And one of these most important services, of course, was a school, so children could learn to read and write. Columbus Tustin himself had 5 children who also needed to go to school. Well, luckily, Columbus Tustin planned very well. When he was planning his city, he set aside an entire block for schools. This map shows what he called the school block. He thought ahead. It was centered between 2nd Street and 3rd Street and C Street and B Street. And actually, that's where some of our school district offices are today. This is a photo of Tustin's very first school on the school block. This little one-room schoolhouse sat among a grove of sycamore trees that you can see surrounding it. So it was called Sycamore School. About 28 children from first grade all the way up through 8th grade attended this school. That means if you were in 3rd grade, your brothers and sisters would be in the same classroom, even if they were only in 1st grade or way up in 8th grade. Columbus Tustin hired Miss Anna Kozad as the first teacher, and she had to teach every student in all of these grades at one time. Of course, women teachers weren't allowed to be married at that time. Students would sit in rows of desks, just like this top picture, with the youngest or the smallest students sitting in front and the older students in the back of the room. Here is what a typical classroom would look like. Now, paper was expensive, so students were expected to bring their own piece of slate and put it in a wooden frame to use for their writing and arithmetic. Well, that's what we call math today. Because everyone sat at wooden desks, they also needed to wrap the frame of their slate with fabric so it didn't make so much noise when it hit the wooden desks. Students also had to bring their own slate pencil and an old rag to wipe off their slate board. Here is a picture of a class, and this class includes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade students all together. And if you look closely at the old photograph, you might notice that often children didn't even wear any shoes to school. Of course, also, this is photograph day for their class picture, and you can see they dressed up in their finest finery, even brought their finest hats. Looks like they may have even borrowed mother's hat. Children had so many chores to complete in the morning at home, like chopping the wood, feeding the chickens, maybe watering the horses, and even more. When they heard the school bell ring, they knew it was time to head for school. Most children who lived near the school would just walk, but if you lived out in the surrounding area, in a farmhouse, maybe on a farm or in an orchard, you might jump on your horse and ride to school. Of course, it was your job to be sure your horse had plenty of water and food while you were in the classroom all day. And of course, during your recess and lunch break, you had to go check on your horse. In 1882, more people began moving to Tustin, which meant they needed a larger schoolhouse. A large 2-story wooden Victorian-style schoolhouse was built near the very first school. Remember, Tustin had set a whole block of property aside, calling it the school block? Well, eventually more schools and buildings were built on this property. In fact, the Tustin Unified School District still owns a part of this property today. This new 2-story building had 4 classrooms, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs. And a few years later, the building was expanded to make more classrooms. It also had the bell tower, which held a large bell that would be rung to call those students to school. The bell was cast in 1887 in New York. Then they put it on a ship, and it came by sea around the tip of South America to eventually reach Tustin. You can still see that bell on display in front of the Tustin Unified School District buildings on C Street in downtown Tustin today. Now, this wooden Victorian school playground had a wooden fence that divided it into 2, one side for the girls and one side for the boys. It also had an outdoor toilet building called an outhouse, a bicycle shed, and a barn where the horses could be stabled while the children were at school. A huge sycamore tree also had a rope hanging from a branch in the middle of the schoolyard. As the community continued to grow, a new grammar school was built in 1914. This new building was built right next to the old wooden Victorian school, which was then torn down. The grammar school had a large auditorium, a home economics classroom where students could learn to cook and sew, a workshop, and even showers in the basement that they could use after their sports. A few years later, in 1921, a new primary school building was built, but only for kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, which was also built on the same school block. So you can see that the population of the city of Tustin was definitely growing. Often students didn't go to school very long because they were needed at home to help on the farm or in the orchards. If students did complete 8th grade, most of them ended their education at that time. Students who wanted to go on would have to go to high school in Santa Ana or to Orange, because Tustin didn't even have their own high school yet. Finally, Tustin High School District was started, and a new 2-story high school building was built on State Highway 101 that ran through the middle of Tustin. It opened in 1922 for students who lived not only in Tustin, but also students from all around the area, from Laguna Beach, El Toro, Mission Viejo, Trabuco Canyon, and even from the Irvine area. Most of those areas were just farmlands at the time and didn't have enough students to open their own school. A school bus would make the rounds to all those areas to pick students up who lived outside of the Tustin area. Now, this new high school also had an indoor auditorium that could seat 1,000 people, an outdoor Greek theater, and up-to-date science classrooms, mechanical training classrooms, an athletic field, a gymnasium, and a few years later, a swimming pool was even added. Tustin students were thrilled to have their very own high school. And then, in 1966, this beautiful building was torn down because it wasn't earthquake safe. Since then, the whole campus has been remodeled and updated. The city of Tustin continued to grow, so in the 1950s and 60s, many more elementary schools and, through the years, 4 more middle schools were added with the population boom. In the 1990s, more schools were built to provide for the new students that were moving into the Tustin Ranch area. And just recently, new schools are being built in the Tustin Heritage and Legacy area of Tustin. Well, we can be very proud that today Tustin has 16 elementary schools, 2 K-8 schools, 4 middle schools, the Legacy Magnet Academy, 4 high schools, and we even have online computer-based learning. That equals up to a total of 28 different schools or learning opportunities in Tustin today. Far more than Tustin City had when it first began with that 1-room schoolhouse that Columbus Tustin first started back in the 1870s.